Rebuild. That word was floating around Canucks Twitter this weekend as part of a discussion. Do the Vancouver Canucks need to do another rebuild, or do they need to do something else, like a retool or a rephilosophy? We discussed on Monday's Shifts and Pucks podcast. Conversation around the idea of another rebuild in Vancouver. And a lot of people talked about that. And I thought maybe this is a good conversation for us to have of what constitutes a rebuild here. We the joke in Edmonton has been, how many rebuilds have been through. I mean, Andrew Cogliano was a former Oiler part of Rebuild 1, Rebuild 2. You had Taylor Hall. You had Neil Yakupov. You've had other situations where they've rebuilt and then rebuilt. I mean, Arizona has been rebuilding since 1997, since they've been in the NHL.
Yeah, I was about to say since they've been in the league. Yeah.
Yeah. Buffalo has been in a constant sense of rebuild. So we hear that word a lot. Of course, one of the teams in the Final Four wrote a letter about the idea of rebuild or re-something. It's a fascinating word that came up again about the idea of Vancouver, tear it all down, bring it back up. Now we're seeing one organization that went from 48 points to a Stanley Cup final, the Colorado Avalanche. Another organization that has been much more consistent in their appearances at the Stanley Cup the last decade. And of course, winning in the Tampa Bay Lightning. But what constitutes a rebuild? Maybe that's the question. What defines a rebuild? How do we know we need a rebuild?
For me, a rebuild is when is a rebuilding of the team's core by acquiring younger players that can they're going to be part of the core for a long time, or that's the plan. If you do not have you don't have a core and you're trying to build that up through the draft, through acquiring younger players, that's a rebuild. If you already have the core and you're trying to build around that, that's not a rebuild.
And like, to me, a perfect trade example of a rebuild, like to build off of Sean's point here, is like what the Flames did with Iginla. You saw the return for Iginla and you're like, who? I don't recognize any of those names, because they were wanting to get young draft capital, or at least promising young players, young prospects, to try and build the new core round. Obviously, none of those in that specific Iginla trade really worked out for the Flames, but I was just using that as a general idea. And maybe I missed the dartboard on that example, but it was just an example.
That's exactly what it is. It's trading star players for draft capital and prospect capital, and hoping that in 3, 4, 5, 6 years that you can be a contender. There's retooling where you're slightly you're still keeping a good portion of the core together, and you're tinkering to find the right mix, but that's not a rebuild.
And I would argue that Vancouver is more closer to a retooling than a rebuild.
I would say that what this management team is looking to do is a retool, because I think they're going to try and build around the core, whether it's just the three, whether it's Petey, Hughes, and Demko, or you include Horvat in that, because I've seen him be listed amongst that in with those three as well. You can build around that. Once you have that core too, and you have to take a jumping off point with the core at some point here when you're doing any sort of rebuild. Once you have that core, you have to take that next step, and this is where a lot of teams struggle. You saw Ottawa struggle with it this year, because I think they feel that they felt that they had a core that they could do that with. Canucks have struggled to do that since having the bubble. But it's you have to, yeah. But now there's contracts on this team, and players on this team that will, and there'll be big names that will not be part of this team going into next season. But that's going to be for me, it's called, that would be constitute a retool. And I do not think that this team needs to be teared down to the studs to change this. I think there's a lot. The difference between people make out the difference between Tampa and Colorado and say Vancouver as immense. While it is big, I don't think it's as big as many make it out to be. And a lot of things can go if you make the right choices, a couple shrewd moves, it expedites things up quickly.
What do you think? What do the Vancouver Canucks need to do? Let us know. Follow us on Twitter at Shifts and Pucks, Facebook.com Shifts and Pucks, YouTube.com Shifts and Pucks, Twitch.com Shifts and Pucks. Subscribe wherever you get your audio, as well as on the Area 51 Sports Network.